Well, Thomas Jefferson is famous and infamous for many things. One thing in particular is currently housed in the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. It's a Bible, sort of. He created it by cutting passages he liked out of a Bible with a razor and pasting them with glue into a collection he titled The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. He took the parts he liked the best and cut out the rest. Made the Bible much more palatable to him. How nice that would be, I sometimes think, to whip out a pair of scissors and cut out the parts of the Bible that don't sit well with us. For me, true confession, I might choose to cut out the gospel passage that we just heard today, the Gospel of Luke. There Jesus goes again, telling yet another story about poverty and wealth and class and status. Jesus told a lot of stories in the gospel accounts, but this one's not like those redemptive ones, like the prodigal son or the lost sheep or the lost coin. You remember those. No, this is the story of Lazarus and the rich man, and it's not about making a mistake and repenting and then changing your ways and being welcomed back home. This story is about being rich and burning in hell. See, makes you want to go find the scissors, right? This parable, as you know, is unique to the Gospel of Luke, and it stands out because it's suspiciously similar to popular folklore at the time. In Jewish tradition and even the cultures that surrounded where Jesus lived and worked, there was a strong view of the afterlife, just as it is described here, along with clear, eternal retribution against the wealthy. Morality plays and folktales similar to this one were common, and you can find a story like this in almost every culture, even our own. You might read this story and think of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. His famous story was inspired, he said, by this parable. I wonder when I read it if Jesus was doing the same thing that Charles Dickens did, telling an old story with some modern adjustments just to make a point. But then we have to ask, what point exactly is Jesus trying to make here? Even though we know we're reading some version of a popular morality folktale, imagining Jesus retelling it might lead us to believe that Jesus was saying that wealthy people are bad people. Listen to the contrast he paints. The rich man lived a life of excess wealth, going about his business dressed in the finest linen dyed purple, feasting sumptuously every day. And those listening to the story would immediately know someone of that social and economic stature would live a life of utter luxury with servants to take on any task he had to perform. And then what a contrast. There's Lazarus, utterly wretched, taking his place in line even behind the dogs that prowled in the neighborhood at night, sniffing for whatever scraps they could find. And you heard the rest of the story. Both the rich man and Lazarus die, and the tale tells what happens in the afterlife. Rich man burns in hell, desperate for just a drop of cool water on his tongue, and Lazarus, finally, comforted in the presence of Abraham and the angels, and all the loose ends are tied up, and everybody gets what they deserve, and all of us leave satisfied. Unless, of course, you're the rich man, in which case you might want to join me with a pair of scissors. Reminds me of a cab ride I took last summer in Aspen, Colorado. The driver was telling me as we drove that 90% of the houses in Aspen are occupied 1 month out of the year. There are two kinds of people in Aspen, he told me. People with 3 houses and people with 3 jobs. Great divide, right? And what about this? Here we sit today in one of the richest countries in the world, and you and I are often blind to these appalling facts. Half the world, 3 billion people, live on less than $2 a day. 20% of the population in developed nations consume 86% of the world's goods. and half the world's richest 1% live here in America. If you earn more than $34,000 a year, you fall into that category. In this world, I don't think there's any way to avoid it. We're the rich man, or woman, if you want to be inclusive. We are the ones who eat sumptuously and wear fine purple linen, and if these statistics are correct, we're the ones who waste our food and live lavishly while others languish in poverty and pain and despair. Seems like the message of this parable is pretty straightforward. Rich people are bad, poor people are good, and if you're rich in this life, you're going to burn in hell in the next. Thanks be to God. But Jesus, as you know, is never quite as obvious as he first appears, so we might need to look a little deeper than this first glance interpretation. Note this, the rich man, well, he wasn't just rich. He controlled a lot more than just money. He controlled things like land and laws and systems and what went on in the temple. Even the geography of the city was controlled by the rich. Rich people lived in one section, poor people lived in another. I know it's really hard to imagine this. And the homes of the rich were surrounded by great walls, to keep people we don't want out. And the rich people would decide every day whether the poor people on the other side of the wall could come in and work for them or not. There was a chasm that divided the rich and the poor in life, just like the great chasm that Abraham pointed out to the rich man after his death. And the real sin in this story is not necessarily being rich. It is the rich man's unwillingness to bridge the great divide that came between him and Lazarus. His sin was building and maintaining systems that created a chasm that kept the poor oppressed and stuck in a cycle of injustice, and the wealthy oblivious and unwilling to take responsibility for correcting the inequity. Any of this sound familiar? So how can you and I hear this parable from Luke's gospel in a culture where we own and enjoy so much of the world's wealth? We have no idea how much privilege we have. How can you and I gain the perspective to see our privilege and wealth for what it really is, and to gather the courage to live with generosity and justice? It's a good thing that a clue to this answer is found again in this passage. It's so curious that in Jesus' story from Luke's gospel, it's only the poor man who has a name. We don't know the rich man's name at all. And while Lazarus is ushered into a community of angels and Father Abraham, the rich man is all alone. No community to challenge his privilege. No people around him to hold him accountable. No one to look him in the eye and call him by name and call him out. And this is how you and I learn to live counter to our culture, with open, giving hearts and lives that stand with the oppressed. We surround ourselves with a community of people who stand with us and who help us learn to live, not with our fists clenched in fear, but with open hands and open hearts, using our privilege and our wealth to bridge the great divide. In the sanctuary where I preach on most Sundays, on April 4th, 52 years ago, Martin Luther King Jr. voiced the great lesson of this parable by referencing another. We're called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside. But that will only be one initial act. One day the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be beaten and robbed as they make their way through life. True compassion is more than just flinging a coin at a beggar. It understands that an edifice that produces beggars needs restructuring. Right now, on this side of eternity. In that now famous address, Beyond Vietnam, Breaking the Silence, Dr. King didn't pull any punches when he talked about the three evils of our country: militarism, materialism, racism. More than half a century later, this speech seems even more urgently prophetic. King portrayed the war in Vietnam as an imperial one, undertaken at the expense of the poor. Vietnam, he said, was a symptom of a far deeper malady within the American spirit, and if left untreated, we shall surely be dragged down the long, dark, shameful corridors of time, reserved for those who possess power without compassion and might, without morality and strength, without sight. He was right then, and he is right now. Our country is poisoned by the systems that keep chasms between us deep and unbridged. So many of us in this system are the rich man, and if we keep this up, we are headed straight to hell. I recently read a story by a colleague who lives, as he says, on Jesus' side of the tracks in Charlotte, North Carolina. He's a white man in America, which, as we learned last week, is a very difficult and oppressed class. He told this story. One night, his living room was filled with teenagers from the neighborhood playing cards on a crisp fall evening. As darkness fell, two teenagers from down the street came into the house and said they'd heard gunshots and they were looking for a safe place. So they came to the only safe place they knew. And so the group brought them in, dealt them into the card game, and they started playing cards again. As they were playing, the droning of a helicopter got louder and louder and louder, sirens of police cars cruising the neighborhood, and suddenly there was a loud knock at the door. The police explained they were looking for two young men dressed in dark clothes. Persons seen fitting that description were seen entering his house, my colleague was told. He thought to himself, that description fits every pair of black men on the street at night, which I now know was the point. He tried to explain to the officer, these children who entered my house, they're my friends. They're just coming here for safety. I know them, and I can tell you they are not responsible. You are in the wrong place, and while you're standing here, the real perpetrator is getting away. The police and I discussed, he writes, insofar as you can have a discussion when the other side is fortified by a dozen armed men and a helicopter droning overhead. And the course of action was laid out this way. The victim of an attempted carjacking was sitting in a squad car 1 block over. The two young men were told to walk out onto the porch, and an officer would drive the victim by the house. Every police car is equipped with a blinding light mounted to the roof. So they would stop the car and shine the light on those two young men for the victim to see. Then he could either positively or negatively identify them. The boys insisted, we have to do what the police said. We're innocent, we'll just do it. But my colleague, he didn't know what to do. He didn't think it was smart to let these young boys go stand on the front porch by themselves. But they were insistent, we have to go out there. So this is what everyone in the house did. Everybody in that house went out on the front porch and stood there next to their friends while the police car floodlights glared. He writes, when the weight of a system is designed to crush people you love and it is bearing down on your friends, you stand next to them. You become potential suspects, loving accomplices. When the spotlight is robbing them of their dignity, turning boys into men far too young, you keep your eyes open and you refuse to look away. You become party to the crime of demanding full humanity for your neighbors and nothing less. Neither dispassionate analysis, nor careful moderation, nor silent contentment, nor running away, nor pretending not to see will suffice any longer. It just won't do it. It's time to show up, to stand up, to put ourselves on the line, to bridge the great divide wherever we see its yawning evil pushing us away from our brothers and our sisters. I'm pretty sure that Jesus didn't tell this story to say that rich people automatically end up in heaven. But hoarding what we have, supporting and perpetuating systems that keep the oppressed crippled, and living our lives absent of a community that calls us to account for the way that we use our wealth and privilege will surely lead us all to destruction. What a gift to hear this invitation to reflect, to repent, to think about how we want to live connected and caring for each other in a world where we are constantly being separated from one another. We must follow Dr. King to move beyond the dream he spoke about and make it a reality. And we have to answer the invitation to bridge the divide affirmatively. We do that when we take up the responsibility of reminding each other that our shared calling in this world is to do justice, to change systems, to stand in solidarity with the oppressed, to recognize our own privilege, to open ourselves to share lavishly what we have, to live the gospel out loud. If we can manage to do that for each other, that is when we will bridge the great divide. Today I wanted to invite you to stand. Stand with those who are oppressed and poor, those who are covered with sores, literal and metaphorical, those who scramble for crumbs at the table of excess. We together are community being transformed by the work of God's Spirit, and we will be agents of transformation in the world. We're reminding each other now as we stand that we also stand alongside everyone who doesn't have a fair shot. So as we prepare to sing, would you open a hand or hands as a way of supplication, as a way of standing with those and bridging the great divide? So out of all the parts of my job, doing things like preaching this sermon with all of you is something that it makes me very, very nervous, and probably only second to getting up in the Riverside Pulpit every Sunday morning. So I'll just go ahead and then I had to follow my colleague from yesterday who quoted all my predecessors, and the master class that I was working with is here, and they know all my secrets. I'm very nervous, but happy to be in conversation with you all. I'm going to just give you a little bit of background about myself and my context, and then tell you a little bit about this sermon and sort of how it came to be. And then I would love to have some conversation with you to delve a little more deeply into this text, this sermon, or your process, or anything else that you'd like to be in conversation about. As you heard, I'm the 7th senior minister at the Riverside Church in the city of New York. How many of you have been there? Awesome. The rest of you have to come. I always say it's like Disneyland for pastors, because every Sunday there's somebody that comes to the door like, I'm a pastor from Ohio. And I'm like, why are you at church? Like our church vacation. So, yeah, it's a wonderful, amazing place. My job, for those of you who know the history of the church, has been largely and very vastly administrative. I inherited an administrative system that was deeply broken, and that's the sort of thing that I like to do. And so I have spent a lot of time and enthusiasm and energy around working to make things and systems and staff healthier at Riverside Church. I think that preaching is a key tool in that kind of leadership, particularly if you're leading a congregation through some sort of transformational change, which if you're not, you're probably the only one here. Isn't that right? I think that preaching is the most important tool we have in that task. And I think that a lot of us, because we're busy and we have all of these administrative tasks, tend to think of it as an afterthought. But I'm telling you, it is a tool for powerful leadership, and we leave it on the side to our folly. So that's what I think about preaching. I am a lectionary preacher. This is why. My biggest nightmare would be for Amy to get up every Sunday and preach on whatever she wants to preach on. That would be horrible. So I see the lectionary as sort of discipline for me. Like, I'm given these texts, and it is up to me to figure out how God's Spirit is speaking in this moment through this ancient text to these people in this place, and for what purpose. And that's a challenge that I very much love. Some of you have heard me talk about my process. I go away once a year with 5 colleagues. This was our 15th year together. We meet for an entire week, the first week of August, and we are assigned every year different parts of the lectionary year, and we're required to bring to the table 3 or 4 ideas. So, for example, for Advent this year, if I was going to preach the gospel text, here's where I think I might go. Or I think here's a good off-lectionary possibility that you might want to consider. Or let's look at the prophetic text and come up with a theme like this. And then each person around the table will sit, take in the ideas, and see how it would fit in their own context. So the interesting thing is we all leave at the end of the week with an entire year of preaching planned, and it's all really different from each other. And it's just this really rich table of conversation. I like to preach series, and the reason I do that is I was very anti-series when I first started preaching, because I never wanted to be one of those pastors that was like, 5 steps to a happy marriage. I don't like that. I don't want like a feel-good, prescriptive, entertaining kind of worship experience. But I have found that people engage with the sermon much more if they feel like there's some continuation from week to week, if they feel there's a handle they can hang on to. And so it's been a really fun project for me to come up with sort of new 3 to 5 week series based on the lectionary texts that are assigned. And that might sound impossible, but really it's not. I mean, there's enough going on in the world, there's enough going on in your congregations, there's enough going on in the text that's like an exciting challenge to take on every year. I will say sometimes what I've planned changes. That's just the nature of being relevant in the pulpit. But at least it gives me something to go with, and it gives the colleagues who work with me themes around which they can make educational programs, musical programs, etc., work in tandem with what's going on in worship, so we're not siloed from each other. I guess the 4th general thing that I'd like to say is I preach in a pulpit that has a very, very long and deep prophetic history and legacy. And that's very intimidating, and it feels like a very big responsibility for me, especially in this moment. But just because I have a pulpit like that does not mean that I bear any less responsibility than any of you. I think what I said in that Time magazine article, I still really believe. Like, this is our moment. And, I understand that the institutional church is in decline, and we're all struggling to come up with new and innovative ways to be the church in the world. And so guess what that means? We have so much less to lose. And then also think back to why you got into this work in the first place. I can 100% guarantee it wasn't to get rich. There must have been this moment when you thought, I want to do this work because I want to give my life to the coming of God's kingdom in the world. Remember that? Well, this is the moment. This is the moment to do that. And so I'm always asking myself, what does that mean for me? I'm the first woman. I show up in the pulpit as a white woman. My congregation is largely African American. I follow 2 African American men in the pulpit. How do I speak an authentic prophetic word in my own voice without co-opting the voices of others? This is something that I think about all the time. So all that's background for the sermon. I want to tell you why I chose to bring this particular sermon here to you today. Generally, if I look at a passage and I think, I love that passage, I can see exactly where I want to go with that. That's probably a good hint that I shouldn't be preaching on that passage. Also, that's kind of boring, and I think you would agree with that. I mean, you should feel a little bit of dread and apprehension when you approach the text, because every time is a new possibility and a new opportunity. So I chose this sermon because I hate this gospel passage so much. And I learned it from a young child, what the straightforward meaning of the passage. And I always think it's such an interesting challenge to try to take a passage and flip it over and look at it from a different direction and wake up the people in the pews who are like, oh, the story of Lazarus and the rich man, get them to think about it in a different way and think about it myself a different way. And also, I find this sermon a bit leggy. I find it a bit leggy, and I wanted to try to tighten it up a little bit and see whether I could get a little tighter for you. So that's why I decided to kind of workshop it here with you today myself. So that's why I brought you this sermon, and then I'd like to tell you just sort of 5 markers that I keep in mind when I'm thinking about my own preaching. And then I'd love to be in conversation with you. I think a good sermon has got to have a high degree of engagement in it, like invitation to the folks who are out there. Preaching is a conversation. Preaching is a conversation. That's why sometimes when you get up and preach a sermon, it feels like everybody's asleep and you didn't get it across. And sometimes it feels like, you changed everybody's life. Because it's a conversation, and your sermon is not going to land unless you do the intentional work of engaging the people for whom you're preaching, right? So for me, that works especially well with starting the beginning of the sermon with a little hook that appears several times over the course of the sermon, sort of brings people back to what I was talking about. You can start with some humor. You got to be a little careful with that, but that often works. But if people are not immediately invited to engage in the conversation that's going on when the sermon's being preached, they're going to go to sleep. You're going to lose them. By the time you get to talking about the exegesis of the text, they're not going to be there anyway. So you start with engagement. The second thing that I think is really, 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 really important is good scholarship, right? You do not want to get up and preach a 50-minute super dry lecture on the origins of the Greek in Luke chapter 17. I mean, maybe some of you do, but... No offense. It's so important for your people to know that you're studying these texts, that you take the study and the scholarship of these texts very, very, very seriously, that you, as Tom Long likes to say, have spent the week roughing up the text, taking it out, shaking it around, looking at it from different directions. So your people are depending on you to do the good work of scholarship, to bring them sort of a view of the text that has some depth and some heft to it. And you can see in the sermon I just preached a couple of ways that I tried to communicate that. I talked about the history of the text as a morality play. I threw in there that this text only appears in the Gospel of Luke, things like that, that I are nuggets that are accessible enough for the congregation to take away and think, oh, that's interesting, I didn't know that before. I feel like a Bible scholar, which they should. And they know you're doing good work. That you have, at the very least, a reverence for this text that you are inviting them to share. The third thing that I think is really, really important is there always has to be a prophetic word when we're preaching. There always has to be a prophetic word. I hear from so many people, like I couldn't preach a sermon like that, I would get fired, or my people can't hear that, and those are valid things to pay attention to. But there is a prophetic word somewhere that your people need to hear. There is a prophetic word. At Riverside Church, most of the people sitting in the pews are liberals, I would say. Except one guy a few weeks ago who yelled at me at the door. I don't know how he made it through the whole service, but most of the people sitting there sort of think the same, right? And so I struggle all the time with, like, how do we worship with integrity that takes the lead from the text, that does not turn this into a political rally, which we could do if we went to the March for Our Lives protest in Central Park? I mean, what does the church have to offer this moment that the Kiwanis Club doesn't? If you don't know what it is, then that's a problem. So I was talking to a colleague who I said, I just worry all the time that it's turning into a political rally every Sunday morning, and there's more than enough stuff on the news to mention in a sermon. And he said to me, look, always start with the text and preach the gospel. Because when you preach the gospel, it is necessarily political. When you preach the gospel, it is necessarily political. So I was preaching a sermon a few weeks ago on the passage in Ephesians about the full armor of God. And that passage talks about like evil and the devil. Well, we nice liberal Christians, we don't like to talk about evil and the devil, right? We're too sophisticated for that. But then I thought, I'm going to take my lead from the text. I'm just going to take a deep breath. I'm going to walk into that pulpit. I'm going to talk about evil and the devil. And I don't care what they say. I'm just going to do it. And I just prepared myself at the end for everybody to yell at me. And that was the day that the gentleman who was obviously of a different political opinion than me came through the door so angry. I mean, he was shaking. His face was red. And he started yelling at me like, why are you using your pulpit in a political way? I said, sir, I don't understand what you're talking about. I was talking about the full armor of God and warding off evil. You're talking about the president. I wasn't talking about the president. I was talking about the text. And the text became necessarily political. Okay? There always has to be some prophecy in what you're saying. If there isn't, what are you doing? A fourth thing that I like to think about when I'm thinking about my sermons is integrity. Like, am I showing up in the pulpit as who I really am? Or I'm trying to pretend like I'm somebody different? Am I communicating to the congregation that I don't really like this text? I had a really hard time with it, and I don't understand it either. Because if I'm not, that doesn't have integrity, and it also separates me from the congregation who's sitting out there thinking, what does this mean? I'm probably going to hell. In my congregation, we have the inventor of the universal remote control. He holds the patent on the universal remote control. So I'm thinking about him when I'm reading this passage about the rich man in hell, you know? And it's hard for me to think about preaching that. And I need to step into the pulpit with an integrity around issues like that. I also touched on this a little bit earlier. I came to Riverside Church the month that Michael Brown was murdered. And I could see in the faces of my parishioners, like, oh dear God, what have we done? You know, this white woman up there. And I am on and have been on a long learning process to understand what it means to try to speak a prophetic word to evil that is happening in our country without trying to co-opt the voices of others. Sometimes that means stepping down from the pulpit and giving my platform to somebody else. But I just want to name that as a struggle. I have colleagues who regularly give me feedback around that, but I want to be sure that I'm showing up with as much integrity as I can muster around some of these really hard things. The fifth thing that I always try to think about when I'm thinking about my sermon is action. Like, what is the action that comes from this? I always say, I said earlier this morning, I'm not here to entertain you. I'm not here to entertain you. Like, if you're not sitting here thinking, I got to change something, I got to go out into the world and change something, then I have failed to do my job. There has to be some sort of action that comes out of the sermon. And, you know, we were talking in this sermon about, like, systemic racism and keeping the poor oppressed and misogyny and all this. Like, you're not going to be sitting in the pews thinking, oh, I'll just go right out and fix that. Which is why I did that thing at the end to make you stand up, right? Because I want people to feel it in their bodies that we have some action that we have to take in response to hearing this text. And that is what I have to share with you about this sermon. I would love to be in conversation with you a little more deeply around some of the things you're wondering about.
Amy, before I hand this off, I would like to ask a question, because I rarely do this myself. And that is, you just talked about having colleagues that reflect back. How did you put that group together, and how did they reflect back to you?
So the first 8 years of my pastoral ministry, I was mostly a solo pastor, had some interns. And so I had both this group of colleagues. We call it Preacher Camp. We meet every August. And we also have a Facebook group. It's a closed group called the Saturday Night Sermon Writing Club. And we're on it all week, talking to each other about the text, about what we're thinking, about where we're going, et cetera, et cetera. And I started it when I was a very young pastor, and I was desperate because I just knew I couldn't come up with anything else to say in the pulpit. And I wanted to surround myself with some folks who had more depth of experience. And so a colleague in town and I made a list of, like, the coolest, smartest people we knew in our tradition. And then we asked them to come up for a few days and hang out with us. And it just happened to be this beautiful chemistry that has continued over the course of these years. But I will have to say, 4 of the people in that group are men, and everybody in that group is white. And that's not helpful for me right now. And it shouldn't have been helpful for me before. So, you know, I have the privilege and honor of working with an incredibly diverse staff, all different denominations, all different ages and races and sexual orientation. And I want them to hold me accountable, to give me feedback, to help me understand how to say and convey things better. And then when I was solo pastor at Calvary, I had a friend, a very dear friend, who was a very committed Reformed Jew. I would send her my sermons every Saturday, and she would read them. And she would say, oh, don't go there. No. She helped me, weed out some of the bad habits I was beginning to form. So those have been some ways I've found support.
I'm pretty new at this rodeo, so I'm just wondering if you can tell me, where is hell?
Where is hell? Is that what you asked? Oh gosh, I'm going to out myself theologically. I think there's a whole lot of hell right here on earth. And I think that any sort of theological framework that allows us to put hell off to later is flawed. And I think it's malpractice to preach that kind of theology. And I grew up in evangelical. My parents are very, very conservative evangelicals. And if they heard me say that, they would be praying for me right now. I've just seen it so often used as an excuse not to do what I was talking about doing in this sermon. Just wait till the afterlife. God will take care of everything. There's a whole lot of hell right here.
Reverend Butler, thank you so much for the sermon. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that dread and apprehension that you like to lean into when you approach certain texts, and how you kind of move from perhaps feeling stuck in that dread to opening up the text and see creative ways to approach it.
I'll give you an example. This coming Lent, I'm preaching a series called The Genesis of Sin. And I chose specifically to preach the Sodom and Gomorrah story in that series. And I'm not going to lie, I'm scared about that. Because there's so much cultural baggage around that text. I haven't really studied it very much. I have a preconceived idea of what it's about. I have a lot of people in my congregation who are listening very carefully to hear what I'm going to say. And but I think that sort of dread is motivation for me, right? Like, it's a puzzle I want to unlock, and I want to take a new look at it because I suspect that the way that you and I have been looking at Lazarus and the rich man probably wasn't exactly what Jesus was trying to convey. And so once I can get past that apprehension, that motivates me to begin the study, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But I have to tell you, I've been doing it for 20 years, and I've always come up with a sermon on Sunday. So I think it's some sort of presence of God's Spirit or grace or something that engages us in the conversation with the text. I'm an extrovert, so I need conversation partners around the text. So I often find them with my colleagues at work or on our Saturday night sermon writing club, or some of my interfaith colleagues in the city are very, very helpful and willing to talk through the text. I have a binder, you'll see me carrying it around, that I start on Monday morning that has sort of my plan for where I was going to go this week, and a bunch of articles, many of which are written by you all, and I print them out. I mean, this is not environmentally sound, sorry. I put them in the binder, and I carry it around with me all week. It's like my blankie, you know, like I'm sitting on the bus, I'm reading. I'm sitting in the doctor's office, I'm reading. I'm writing comments down all the time, things I'm trying to think of, until something just emerges, right? It's kind of like a path to get from here to here through the text. And when that finally comes, sometimes later than I wish, I feel like the luckiest person that we get to do this. Like, we get to take the text apart and look at it in new and life-giving ways. Is that your experience? Happy to hear it.
I love what you did with the text also. The lectionary this coming Sunday is Job. And I'm going to start at a place I've never started. I'm going to start with Job's wife. And she says, you're going to persist in your integrity. Why don't you curse God and die? You mentioned the word integrity. I liked what you did with it, but could you flesh that word out more? We use it so much. I wonder if there's any other way of looking at that word integrity.
I think for me it's maybe two things. One is showing up as authentically yourself in the conversation with the text. Like, I know it's dangerous to do that because a lot of us serve congregations with mean people. And I know it's our initial response to like protect ourselves, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think there's more power in vulnerability, in being transparent, in showing that you too are someone who is struggling with the text and struggling to make sense of how the text informs your life and the world. And so part of it for me is that, vulnerability, transparency, et cetera, et cetera. Another part of that integrity is just being willing to do the work that it takes to unmine the text. I get criticized sometimes from some of my colleagues because I talk about the word excellence all the time. And they're like, that's a corporate word, that's a corporate word. It is not a corporate word. And even if it is, we're taking it back because we do the work of God in the world. And if anybody's work should be excellent, it should be ours, right? Like, this is an important, holy moment. We have to apply that level of excellence and work to it. And for me, that's the other part of the integrity piece. I'll think some more on that, though. Thank you.
You talked a little bit about the weaknesses in your preaching that some of your colleagues had pointed out for you. Can you talk about what those weaknesses were?
All right, we'll start from... I mentioned to the master class yesterday that I was re-watching my sermon from Sunday because it was all about Esther and it was a little controversial. And I just like rock back and forth too much and it's very distracting. So I have to like stop doing that. When I was at Calvary, I got in this rhythm where I would say the phrase, "you see," like 50 million times. And finally one of my colleagues was like, you have to stop it. Like, stop saying that. We see. Don't stop saying that. So there's that. And then some of you may have heard this story before. As I mentioned, Michael Brown was murdered right when I got to Riverside. And my colleague, Michael Livingston, who's African-American Presbyterian, toward the end of his career, he and I decided together we were going to do this 7 last word service. It was being done all over New York, and it was like 7 last words of African Americans who were killed by police, right? So like, Mom, I want to go to college, or I can't breathe. And so we had we were lining up 7 preachers to come in and do this service of lament. And I mentioned to Michael, like, I don't know, I'm not sure which of the words I want to preach. And he said to me, oh, you're not preaching any of these words. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, I've been pastor of this church for 3 months. I have to show them that I got to get up and I got to preach a fiery sermon. He was like, you need to sit down and shut up. Let other voices speak. And what a gift to have colleagues like that around you. Because I was so mad at him. Like, just so mad at him. And then like halfway through the service, I was like, oh my gosh. He was right. You know, you need to have people like that who tell you the truth about how you show up. It's the only way to get better.
There was one other person who was right over here. Thanks.
I see that you use a manuscript, and I use a manuscript, and sometimes after working on my sermon all week, and I've got a good sermon all written and ready to go, and then I got this 40-minute commute coming into church, and the Holy Spirit comes, and it's usually something that's with the news that intersects with the text. Do you ever, like, in that 40 minutes Sunday morning, whatever, come into church and just like, okay, I gotta just throw away what I've written and speak what the Spirit's telling me? And how do you work that?
Okay, so first of all, I don't think a sermon is ever done until you preach it. And we put my sermons up on like Twitter and so on and so forth. So I'm supposed to get my manuscript to our communications staff ahead of time, and they have this running joke, like I'll send like 6 or 7 versions of it, like up to the last minute. Last one, I promise. No, really, this is the last one. So A, I don't think a sermon is ever done until it's preached. B, I don't think it's impossible for the Spirit of God to come in and say, throw out your manuscript and preach something different, but I think it's very rare. You just have to be very careful about that. Maybe I've done that once in my career, because I don't trust my own ability to see between the Spirit of God or Amy's personal opinion and what she wants to say. So for me, the manuscript keeps me honest, and I depend on the manuscript because, as I told the master class yesterday, I'm scared to know what I would say without the manuscript. Just some thoughts.
You spoke a little bit about the importance of the sermon to the congregation and the danger of marginalizing that a little bit. Could you speak a little bit to what you do to protect, for lack of a better term, sermon prep, and what counts on what you will allow to infringe on that or encroach on that? Does that make sense?
Well, in the interest of integrity, this is just a constant struggle, you know? All of us have to be at church council meetings and all the things, you know? And for me, anyway, like writing a sermon takes, like you gotta get into the text, you gotta think about it. One thing that's been very freeing for me is just, I have this rhythm where I start on Monday and I read, and to forgive myself for not like being like Harry Emerson Fosdick and going into a room for 2 days and not coming out every week. This is not going to work for me. Sermon prep happens all the time. Pay attention to what's happening around you. Pay attention to your interactions with people. Pay attention to what you see on the news. Have a conversation with someone. You know, I'm really struggling with this text. I'm wondering how it's going to land in the congregation this week. That's sermon prep. That's sermon prep. I also have an administrative support colleague who is super smart, and she knows that I'm going to overcommit myself all the time. So she's really mean to me, and she like blocks things out on my calendar. And I once had a good colleague who told me, put the time on your calendar and say, outside commitment. Like, nobody's going to be like, you can't go to your outside commitment. I mean, like, you know, it's already there. It's already blocked out. This is going to be your time. I also have spaces that I like that are generative for me. There's a place in my house. It's called the Happy Room, so everything in there makes me happy. Like, leave all the other crap outside, go in. And that's a place where I can really be in the presence of God and think deeply about the text. And I don't think there's any answer to this question, is basically what I'm saying.
I was just wondering if you listen to sermons, and if so, who are the people that you go to most often to listen to what they have to say?
I find it extraordinarily difficult to listen to sermons on a text when I am writing on that text. Because all I do is sit there thinking, oh, they did it so much better, I'll never be able to do it. I'm lame, I should quit now. And I don't find that to be helpful. One thing I do very often is I listen to Sermon Brainwave, and sometimes, often I disagree with them out loud. And then my colleague Jim Somerville has this little business called A Sermon for Every Sunday. Do any of you know about that? Some of the best preachers in America are on that website. You can go in there and watch Michael Curry, Tom Long. Those are some of the people I think are amazing. They're all preaching for A Sermon for Every Sunday.
With respect to the preaching, I wonder the action plan, you talk about part of your framework, and as I listen to your sermon, you talk about great divide. We see the reality in our society, and also what is needed for the healing and reconciliation, because over and over I have seen, I have experienced, I have lived in neighborhood where there's social divide, whether it's the west end of town and all the other things you think about. I've been in a system where the white privilege and everything else. And I've listened to preacher, we refer back to slavery and what have you, and quotes Martin Luther King and everything else you think about. And I wonder, within yourself, the transparency within ourselves, the community, what action we need to bring that sense of hard work, of loving our neighbor, and yet also the celebration of the text. Where does that lead in your preaching?
Well, that's a whole other conversation that we can have over lunch, but in terms of how to think of it in a homiletical framework, this is why I do this work. Because, and I'm telling you all this right now, you do not have to give answers every week. That's not your job. It's not your job is to disrupt the comfort of the people in the pews and make them go out and find answers on their own. And this is why I do this work, because I could go out there and do my best efforts to heal the world, and I want to do that, and I try to do that. But what if I did the work of forming a community of people who also felt that their calling and their obligation was to go out and heal the world? That's going to generate a lot more healing than me just doing it myself. And so I want to be careful that we are clear with ourselves. We're not up there to give answers. We're up there to hold out the text and the call and to kick people in the butt. See? So they go out there and find the answers themselves.
I'll grab yours in just a second.
Okay. It is such a gift to hear a woman preach, especially a woman who occupies a big pulpit, because there aren't that many of you. And you talked about how intimidating, maybe that wasn't your word, but how intimidating it was to step into that pulpit. But I also wonder, as sort of the tides turn in the church and in church leadership, as baby boomers retire and more women are graduating from seminary, what are the opportunities for women in the pulpit? What what is less intimidating and more of a gift to people having a female voice in the pulpit.
Evan, I'm going to switch over to handheld.
Yeah, people ask me this question a lot. So if we look back over the history of social movements, what happens when institutions become less prominent and powerful? That's when the women get the jobs. So let's just be honest about that. That's what's going on. But also we're in this very unusual time in our country's history where women's voices are rising to the fore and are often taking up causes that are efforts to heal our communities. I think it's good discipline for everyone in the pews to hear a feminine voice. I thought particularly this past Sunday, it was really important for the women who were speaking to raise their voices. That said, you can be a woman and be a really crappy preacher. So what you and I live with every day, you have to be better, you have to be better, you have to do better, you have to be better. It's in the church, and it will be in the church. But the more of us that are speaking up and getting into pulpits, the more we're going to be creating space for the women who are coming behind us. And they're going to change the church. It's going to be awesome.
Last one.
Well, thank you for a wonderful master class yesterday. You affirmed all of us, kicked my butt pretty good too, along with the affirmation, so I appreciate it. I really do. I'm a Lutheran married to a Baptist, and we make it work. And I'm curious to know, I know you're part of an interdenominational congregation and leading that. Could you speak to that part about having different pastors from different denominations as well as a congregation that way, and how that informs your preaching and your leadership?
That's such a great question. So I'm a Baptist too, and when I was pastor at Calvary Baptist in Washington, D.C., it was very important to me to teach Baptist distinctives, Baptist identity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality of life, especially in metropolitan areas these days, is like people are not going to be like, oh, I think I'll go to a Baptist church. It's just not happening. People go where they find community, where they find a message that is helping them live in the world. And so we have to find a way to begin responding to that. So as you know, Riverside Church is American Baptist and United Church of Christ. And we also think we're better than everybody else, so we kind of have our own thing going on. And that's dangerous because it turns into like the McDonald's of church. Like, please drive through and order whatever you want. Check on the form. You want to be dunked? You want to be sprinkled? You want to be poured? I was like, no, we're not doing that. So one of the things that's helped is have colleagues. I have an AME colleague. I have a Presbyterian colleague. I have a couple of Methodist colleagues. I think the only one, well, I don't have a Lutheran right now. And I have never had an Episcopalian in my staff yet. But I found that diversity is a lovely richness because it helps us present the alternative ways we, for example, do baptism in a way that has theological and liturgical meaning. Whereas before it was just like, why are the babies getting sprinkled and why is that person wet? I don't really know. And so we make sure we explain it every single time. Why I'm up in the tub and Michael Livingston's on the floor with the babies, you know? And, you know, part of my Baptist self is like, ugh. Like, one time I sprinkled a baby, I'll just confess. But it was, I felt so dirty afterwards. I just kept doing it. So we do what we do well, and we try to express a grace-filled, invitational, liturgical experience for the whole congregation so that they can enter in where they feel most comfortable. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.